Sounds like it's working? Yeah? Cool. Thanks for having me. I am Sam Tasker. I am Policy Officer at Freshwater Habitats Trust. For those of you who don't know us, we're a national freshwater conservation charity interested in reversing the kind of long-term decline of freshwater wildlife. And we do that in particular by focusing on the small freshwater habitats, which have tended to be kind of overlooked in government programmes of water management. But I thought I'd talk today, I'd like put my title in as being about policy. I thought it's a bit dry probably for a Monday evening. So I thought I'd kind of take it back a couple steps and try and explain why we think ponds are so important and how they could kind of drive nature recovery in this country. So, take a mouse. So yeah, I'll be covering a brief history of ponds, why ponds matter, and what policy gets wrong for ponds and how we can get it right. But firstly, I thought I'd kind of tackle a common misconception about ponds. So I know I'm addressing kind of an audience of very enlightened naturalists this evening, and I'm sure this isn't how you envision ponds in your mind. But I think in the public imagination, all too often, because of how ubiquitous this kind of feature, maybe a 2-metre kind of puddle, muddy puddle at the end of the garden, maybe a few fish, a little water fountain, how many of those there are in our lives, we tend to overlook countryside ponds. There's 3 million of these garden ponds in England and Wales, and some of them are really great for wildlife. But ponds are actually an ancient, natural feature of our landscapes and a really important component of freshwater ecosystems. So, the ponds I'll be talking about for the rest of the talk are what we call countryside ponds, so ponds outside of people's gardens. There's about 300,000 at the moment, by our best estimation, in England and Wales. Which adds up to about 2 per square kilometres. So ponds are defined as a standing body of water between 1 metre and 2 hectares in size, so that's like 200 by 100 metres, it's quite big, and they can be full of water for 4 months of the year or the whole year. Both types are important for biodiversity. Ponds have existed on Earth really as long as there's been solid ground and an atmosphere capable of producing rain. The first life might have begun in ponds of a sort, so in these kind of hot hydrothermal pools like you can see in Yellowstone National Park today. But the first thing we've recognised as an animal in a pond has been recorded from the early Cambrian, so about 500 million years ago. And really ever since then, ponds have been a component of freshwater ecosystems. So if you think back to the Devonian, when these kind of primordial forests blanketed much of the world, there would have been loads of treacle holes, and those often would have become ponds. Before humans engineered rivers so widely, floodplains were much more chaotic. The river would have chosen a new path very frequently, and it would have left behind ponds and pools on the floodplain, like those oxbow lakes that we all heard so much about in our school geography classes, and never since. And there were also some really enigmatic components of the kind of prehistoric pondscape. So ponds would have been kept open by the wallowing of megafauna, much like they are today by livestock. There's a process that geologists call dinoturbation, which is the poaching of pond margins by dinosaurs. Important to note that ancient natural ponds still exist in Britain today. So a really good example is a pingo pond. So there's real concentrations of these in Herefordshire, on the kind of borders of England and Wales, and down in Norfolk and Suffolk. And what pingos are is on the edge of like periglacial, what would you call it? The edge of like an ice sheet, or anyway, on the edge of that bit, you have ice lenses forming below the ground, so like a circular lump of ice. I'm not a geologist, so you have to bear with me here. And they'd have sediment gathering on top of them, which would kind of slowly slough off. So what you had once the ice melted, maybe 8,000 years ago, is you're left with kind of a raised rim of sediment, and this really characteristic circular depression. And those ancient ponds, like pingos, are really important for some freshwater species. Some species are not very good at getting around the landscape, they're poor dispersers, and for those species, like particularly beetles in pingo systems, the kind of longevity of the habitat and the landscape really matters. So these ancient ponds that we have are really important, these ancient natural ponds. But most of the ponds in the landscape are man-made, and in general that doesn't mean they're less important for biodiversity. So we've been making ponds in Britain pretty much since we've been here. The first recorded clearly intentional pond is from a gravel excavation in Berkshire, and has been dated back to 500 years ago. It was intentionally lined with clay for some purpose, and really since then, as I say, we've been making ponds either intentionally or as a kind of byproduct of our extraction of things from the ground. By the late 19th century, there were about 800,000 ponds across England and Wales. We think that's potentially the peak of pond density in England and Wales, and those man-made ponds might partially have compensated for the loss of aquatic habitats, which was going on at the time because of river engineering, because of the drainage of wetlands. But unfortunately, since then, we have suffered quite a catastrophic loss of ponds from the landscape. And a kind of particular moment when that process accelerated was the early 20th century, where we were intensifying our agricultural systems and ponds were getting infilled really widely. The kind of degree of pond loss does vary regionally. So in County Durham, we think around 40% of ponds were lost during that period. On the edges of London, actually, urbanisation meant that nearly 100% of ponds were lost. But the pattern, although it varies, is consistent across the country. We lost a lot of our ponds over the last couple hundred years. Fortunately, we have begun to turn things around. So between the 90s and 2007, so the two national pond surveys, which are kind of the best data we have on pond density in the landscape, pond numbers increased by 12.5%. We think that's continuing. That's really a result of conservation efforts. So it's an encouraging sign, but we could do so much more if there were more policy support, as I'll get onto. But firstly, I want to talk about why it matters that we've lost all these ponds. So this finding might come as a surprise to some of you in the room. So this figure here shows the number of species of aquatic plants and large invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, in rivers, ponds, lakes, streams and ditches in a sort of typical agricultural landscape near Oxford, in Coles Hill. And we were actually the first, surprisingly, in the early 2000s to look at comparative biodiversity of different freshwater habitat types. What lives where, what supports the most species. So we did stratified samples of all the different freshwater habitat types in the landscape. And what we found was that ponds actually collectively, when you add up all the species in each habitat type, so gamma diversity, ponds support more species of large invertebrates, which make up most of the animals in freshwaters, and aquatic plants than did your big rivers and lakes, which are kind of the focus of statutory management. And that finding's since been repeated in the UK, across Europe, and as far afield as southern China in agricultural landscapes. There are a couple of things that drive that pattern, and one in particular I want to talk about. So one reason for this is that because ponds have small catchments, a catchment being the bit of land that drains into the water body, because they have small catchments, they're much more likely to be kind of physically, chemically variable, because they reflect the geology of their immediate surrounds, for instance, which means that they can support in a local area much more kind of habitat specialists than can big rivers and lakes, which tend to kind of average out their surrounds in these big catchments. But a kind of more important property in our very widely polluted agricultural landscapes is that by having a small catchment, you're more likely to, incidentally really, be situated in a pocket of land, say semi-natural grassland, bit of woodland, where you're not fed by polluted runoff. And as a result, ponds are more likely to contain clean water, which can support those sensitive plants and animals which have been lost from large waters. So, what's the next slide? We can exploit this property. So this is another figure. So the guidance said not to use figures, but these two are too good not to share. So this is another figure from our water-friendly farming project in Leicestershire, where we had a 10 kilometre square, very typical, quite intensively managed agricultural kind of mixed landscape, and we dug 20 new ponds. We were locating them in little bits of the landscape where we knew the catchment wouldn't fill them with polluted runoff. The total land take was about 3 hectares of all the 20 ponds, and they would have cost like a few thousand each, so it's quite a cheap intervention in the scheme of things. And what we saw across the whole catchment, again these are censuses of every freshwater habitat type, we saw a 16% increase in wetland plant species richness and an 80% increase in regionally uncommon species, which overwhelmingly are those species which really struggle to survive in modern polluted freshwater habitats. And again, that finding's been repeated since, and we think, another thing I should mention actually, that this kind of restoration potential, it's not confined just to ponds. Because species generally are good at moving between different freshwater habitat types, most freshwater species are generalists, which can live in a pond or a slow-flowing reach of a river, etc., etc. If you have rich ponds in the landscape, they can enrich freshwaters as a whole and increase the resilience of those systems, creating kind of source populations to spread out as other freshwater habitats recover. So we think that ponds can drive the recovery of freshwater ecosystems, in short. But, the big but, there's not really enough policy support for us to do this work systematically across England and Wales. So at the moment, ponds and actually small freshwater habitats in general are neglected by our kind of approach to managing the water environment. So this is the kind of overarching bit of legislation we have is the Water Framework Directive, which is something that we inherited from the EU. It was developed in like the late 90s. I think it was enacted in the UK in maybe 2001, it was the early 2000s. And important to note, that's before these papers that came out by us and others demonstrating how important small waters were collectively for supporting biodiversity in freshwaters. And as a result, the regulatory framework thought bigger, better, bigger, more important, and focused really only on large waters, on lakes bigger than 50 hectares, which is massive, that's like 0.5 square kilometres, so 4% of the lakes in the country, and on big-ish rivers. So this is kind of, just because I have this on my computer, I've used one from Leicestershire, but you'd see this also across Northumbria. This is kind of a diagram of, this is a WFD water body, so they've got these all up on the internet, you can click on one for your local area. The only bit of the river network which is mapped on that system is this dark blue line. So you can see a huge proportion, the vast majority of the running water network is excluded from mapping, and some area teams might survey up the main channel, they might survey a couple of side trips, but generally these smaller streams are overlooked. And on the left, you can see all the standing waters in that catchment. None of those are monitored. And that means that the management decisions we're making aren't taking into account the majority of the water environment. And it makes it quite difficult to fund work on the majority of the water environment. But, fortunately, we're at a kind of inflection point right now. So, this new government came to power promising to clean up our lakes, rivers and seas. Whether they'll deliver that remains to be seen. But they are engaging with freshwater conservation charities, freshwater researchers, and we're really hopeful that in their upcoming water reform bill, we might be able to make a start on changing this kind of long neglect of small waters, and in so doing, drive the recovery of freshwater wildlife. The fight continues. So I don't know how long it took, but hopefully there's time for questions.